This is the end of the world. 4.5 million square kilometers of silence, of ice, of a cold so absolute. It feels like the planet itself has turned its back on life. Antarctica, the most hostile, desolate, merciless place. A continent where the temperature plunges to minus 89 degrees Celsius, where the wind carries the force of a freight train, where nothing grows, nothing breathes, nothing survives without modern technology and extraordinary human determination. If you were dropped onto its surface without protection, you would be dead within minutes. And yet, 90 million years ago, this very place, these very coordinates on the globe, looked nothing like this. 90 million years ago, where that ice now stretches for thousands of kilometers, there was a jungle. A dense, towering, steaming rainforest, alive with the sound of running water and rustling canopy, rich with flowering plants and ancient trees, inhabited by unique creatures. The same continent, the same location on the map. A world so completely unrecognizable from what we see today. The human mind, conditioned by everything it has ever seen or been told about Antarctica, instinctively refuses to believe it. But the evidence is there, buried beneath 3 kilometers of ice, preserved in the sediment of the seafloor, and it is irrefutable. This is the story of a paradise that the Earth forgot, and the extraordinary science that is bringing it back. To truly understand what Antarctica once was, we have to take the entire world and rebuild it from scratch. Because the planet that existed 90 million years ago was not simply an older version of the one we live on today. It was a fundamentally different place, governed by different rules, shaped by different forces, and running at a temperature that would be almost unrecognizable to a modern human being. This was the Cretaceous period, the age of the dinosaurs. And the Earth was deep in the grip of what scientists call a greenhouse world. Carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere were between 4 and 8 times higher than anything we measure today. The oceans were warmer. The poles were warmer. The very concept of a polar ice cap, the permanent, year-round sheets of ice that we take for granted at both ends of the Earth, simply did not exist. There was no ice at the North Pole. There was no ice at the South Pole. The planet, from equator to pole, was blanketed in warmth, and in that warmth something extraordinary was happening. At the bottom of the world, Antarctica, already sitting at roughly the same southern latitude it occupies today, should by all logic have been too far from the sun, too cold, too dark to sustain a forest. In our modern climate, it would be impossible. But in the Cretaceous world, the atmosphere itself was doing something we have no modern equivalent for, trapping heat. With such efficiency that warmth was pushed into the very furthest corners of the globe, reaching places that today receive almost no solar energy. And in that unlikely, improbable warmth, at the edge of the inhabitable world, a forest was born. For most of human history, the idea that Antarctica had once been covered in jungle was treated as a curiosity. An interesting geological footnote, suggested by fossil fragments and the general theory of continental drift, but never proven. With the kind of hard, physical, undeniable evidence that would silence all doubt. That changed in 2020, when a team of researchers from the Alfred Wegener Institute in Germany published the findings of an expedition that had ventured into the dark, freezing waters off the coast of West Antarctica. Working from a research vessel on the surface of one of the most remote seas on Earth, the team had drilled down into the seafloor, extracting long cylinders of sediment, cores of compressed history, each layer representing thousands of years of material that had slowly settled onto the ocean floor and been locked there ever since. When they reached the layers deposited approximately 90 million years ago and examined what was inside, what they found was not rock, not mineral, not the inert geological material they might have expected. What they found was life. Ancient pollen grains from flowering plants, fossilized spores, and most astonishingly of all, a dense and intricate network of fossilized roots. The unmistakable signature of a forest that had not merely existed but had flourished, had grown undisturbed for thousands of years, had sent its roots deep into the earth, and built the kind of complex underground architecture that only a fully mature woodland can produce. This was not a theory anymore. This was physical proof, 90 million years old, extracted from the floor of the Antarctic Ocean. And it was sitting in a laboratory in Germany, under a microscope, telling its story to anyone willing to listen. The location of this sediment core made the discovery even more staggering. It had been taken from a site at 82 degrees south latitude, 900 kilometers from the geographic South Pole, 900 kilometers from the coldest point on the surface of this planet. There had been a rainforest. The implications of that single fact took the scientific world's breath away. Armed with the sediment data, with fossil records gathered over decades from across the Antarctic continent, and with increasingly sophisticated climate modeling software, scientists have now been able to do something that seemed like pure fantasy. Just a generation ago, they have reconstructed this lost world, layer by layer, detail by detail, until a picture has emerged that is as vivid as any landscape alive on Earth today. The dominant trees of this ancient forest were likely ancestors of the Araucaria, an extraordinary species of conifer that still survives today at the southern tip of South America, and in isolated pockets of the Pacific, one of the oldest tree lineages on the planet, a living relic of the Cretaceous world. These ancient giants rose above a forest floor that was dense with giant ferns, thick mosses, and flowering plants that had evolved specifically for the most unusual growing conditions on the planet, because this forest, despite all its warmth and abundance, existed at the very edge of what is biologically possible. Every winter, Antarctica would have plunged into 4 straight months of complete and total polar darkness, not a reduction in daylight, but the complete absence of sunlight for a third of the year. And then every summer, 4 unbroken months of continuous daylight, the sun never setting, the light never fading. The plants and trees of this forest had evolved over millions of years to survive this violent rhythm, shutting their systems down entirely during the long darkness, then exploding into furious, almost desperate growth the moment the sun returned. It was a forest unlike any that has existed before or since. And moving through it, beneath those ancient canopies, along those warm rivers, across that rich, dark forest floor, were animals. Dinosaur fossils have been recovered from Antarctica. Bones and fragments of creatures that evolved in this isolated southern world, cut off from the great dinosaur populations of the northern continents, developing along their own evolutionary lines into species that existed nowhere else on Earth. Antarctica was not merely a forest. It was its own world, sealed, self-contained, ancient, beyond imagination. And almost everything that lived within it has been lost to time, buried beneath the ice that came later, waiting in the dark for the scientists who will one day find them, a continent of jungle, of towering trees and warm rivers, and creatures that the rest of the world would never know. A paradise at the bottom of the earth, thriving, breathing, ancient, and then gone. Not gradually, not peacefully. Something came for this world with a geological force so total, so irreversible, that it buried every trace of it under kilometers of ice and left behind nothing but silence and white. In Part 2, we follow the trail of that catastrophe, the breaking apart of continents, the rerouting of oceans, the slow and terrible freezing of a world that had been warm for hundreds of millions of years. And we ask the question that every scientist who has stood on the ice of Antarctica and thought about what lies beneath it has eventually had to ask themselves, could it happen again? For tens of millions of years, the great southern forest endured. It survived the slow turning of the seasons, the long polar winters, the violent summers of endless light. It adapted, and it thrived, and it spread across a continent that the rest of the world had no knowledge of and no access to. But deep beneath the surface of the earth, forces were already in motion that no forest, no matter how ancient, no matter how resilient, could survive. The story of how Antarctica died is not the story of a single catastrophe, not an asteroid, not a volcano, not a sudden and dramatic extinction event that can be pinned to a single moment in time. It is something slower than that, and in many ways more terrifying. It is the story of a world being dismantled piece by piece over millions of years by the very planet it was built upon. And it begins with the breaking apart of continents. For hundreds of millions of years, Antarctica had been part of Gondwana, the great southern supercontinent, that also contained what would eventually become South America, Africa, Australia, India, and the Arabian Peninsula. These landmasses were not separate then. They were joined, fused at their geological edges, sharing coastlines and river systems, and ecosystems in a single vast landmass that dominated the southern hemisphere. But the Earth's crust is not fixed. It never has been. Beneath the surface, enormous plates of rock float on a churning layer of semi-molten mantle, grinding against one another over timescales so vast they are almost meaningless to a human mind. And during the Cretaceous period, and the tens of millions of years that followed, Gondwana began to tear itself apart. First, Africa and South America pulled away from each other, opening the South Atlantic Ocean between them. Then India broke free and began its long northward journey toward Asia, a collision that would eventually throw up the Himalayas. Then Australia began to separate from Antarctica, pulling slowly northward, widening the gap between the two continents millimeter by millimeter, year by year, century by century. And finally, South America, the last remaining land bridge connecting Antarctica to the rest of the world, began to drift away. Antarctica was being set adrift, alone, at the bottom of the world. The separation of Antarctica from South America was not simply a geographical event. It was a climate event, one of the most consequential in the history of this planet. Because when that final land bridge broke, when the last physical connection between Antarctica and the rest of the world's land masses was severed, something happened to the ocean that surrounded it. Before the separation, ocean currents in the southern hemisphere were forced to interact with the continents around Antarctica, bumping into coastlines, being deflected northward, mixing warm tropical water with the cooler southern seas, and distributing that warmth around the bottom of the world. But once Antarctica stood completely alone, once there was open water in every direction surrounding it, a new current was born. Scientists call it the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, and it is by volume the most powerful ocean current on the face of this earth, unobstructed by any landmass. Driven by the prevailing winds of the Southern Ocean, this current began to circle Antarctica in an endless, unbroken loop, moving vast quantities of water around the continent with extraordinary force. And in doing so, it created something that had never existed. At the South Pole before, it created a wall, a barrier of cold, circulating water that wrapped around Antarctica and cut it off from the warm ocean currents of the north, currents that had, for hundreds of millions of years, been carrying tropical heat down to the southern edge of the world and keeping it alive. With that warmth now blocked, the temperature over Antarctica began to fall, slowly at first, then faster, then in a descent that nothing could stop or reverse. The glaciation of Antarctica did not happen overnight. It was not a single winter that never ended, not a freeze that came and locked everything in place in one terrible season. It was a process that unfolded over millions of years, advancing and retreating, stuttering and surging, covering parts of the continent in ice and then releasing them again, before eventually, irreversibly, winning. The first permanent ice sheets are believed to have appeared in Antarctica approximately 34 million years ago, at a boundary in geological time that scientists call the Eocene-Oligocene transition. At this point, the atmospheric carbon dioxide levels that had kept the planet warm during the Cretaceous had been falling. For millions of years, drawn down by the weathering of rocks, absorbed by the ocean, locked away in marine organisms that sank to the seafloor when they died. As CO fell, the greenhouse effect weakened, the planet cooled, and Antarctica, already isolated by its encircling ocean current, already cut off from the warming influence of the tropical seas, was the most vulnerable place on Earth to that cooling. The ice came from the highlands first, forming on the peaks and ridges of Antarctica's interior mountains, just as glaciers form today on the summits of tropical peaks that are cold enough at altitude even in a warm world. Then it spread down the slopes, across the plains, toward the coastlines, filling the valleys and the riverbeds and the forests, advancing over the landscape with a slowness that made it invisible in any single lifetime but unstoppable across geological time. The trees that had dominated this continent for millions of years could not migrate. There was nowhere to go. The ocean surrounded them on every side. They could only stand as the cold advanced and fall one by one as the ice reached them and be buried, preserved in some cases almost perfectly beneath the weight of a world that was remaking itself without them.